How we doing today, guys? Sam out here with our big rockfish kickoff and pen sales event. I am joined by Shawn Kimbro, a man who needs no introduction, guys. He's been doing this for a long time out here on the bay, and he really specializes in light tackle casting. So it's something that gains more and more popularity every year, as I'd assume you'd agree. It gets bigger and bigger. It's a great way to catch a lot of fish, big fish, with using really light gear, and it's a lot more fun and a lot of action. So Shawn's going to kick it off here. He's got some questions that a lot of you guys ask frequently, and we're going to go over a few things.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that, man. I had to tell it on Sam. Sam and I have been friends for a while now, and the first time I met him was probably up at Pasadena Sports Fish, and he was there with his dad, about that tall, I guess, and motivated about fishing, and has still been that way. And I'm sure you love working at Anglers.
Absolutely.
And Anglers is very fortunate to have you. So
I appreciate that.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Those of you in the parking lot, be careful. There are cars that are coming through here. I don't want to have to jump down and start showing off my BLS skills here, not what they are. But most of you all know me. I apologize. I'm a little bit hoarse. This all this pollen in the air has kind of got me. But hopefully I can get through this all right. And I wanted to start out by telling you just a little bit about me. All of you all know me, but you know that I'm originally from Tennessee, moved up here 15 years ago. When I lived in Tennessee, I was a dock rat. My father had boat docks, and so I grew up docking boats, putting gas in boats, and fishing all my life. I can't remember the first fish I caught. I heard Kayla talking there earlier, and she was talking about she saw some pictures of herself, and she doesn't remember them because it was so long ago. And I suspect it's like the same way with her that it is with me. Is when you grow up in a fishing family like we did, you don't remember the first fish you caught because you fished all the time, right, Kayla? But I hope you all caught her talk because it was really good. Kayla comes at striper fishing with a freshwater perspective, with a shallow water, freshwater perspective. And that's really important because a bass is a bass. And, you know, she can catch largemouth bass and smallmouth bass up there in the river and apply those same techniques right here in the bay. And that's exactly what I'm doing. Exactly the same thing. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And, you know, after releasing my third book and doing, you know, if you can do a book tour and never go 50 miles from your house, I'm an expert at that. Because I get to go around and visit all the tackle shops and meet all the people around. And if you can do a book tour and stay close to home, well, that's kind of what I do. And I get a lot of questions, and a lot of questions come in over the internet too. And so I thought that it might be interesting to just do a talk and just cover those questions and what, you know, some of the things that people are most likely to ask about light tackle fishing. And so this isn't one of the questions, but the first thing is we'll define what is light tackle fishing. And my definition of light tackle, Sam, is just casting and retrieving lures. A lot of times you hear the term light tackle jigging, and I don't usually use that term just because jigging is only one tool in the arsenal. I mean, I'm also throwing topwater plugs, I'm casting spoons, I'm throwing rattle traps, I'm throwing jerk baits, I'm throwing all kinds of other lures as well. And it's really, jigging is just one aspect of light tackle fishing. So the first question, and the very first question I always get is, what kind of rod should I use? So, and it's a great question. And I noticed that Penn is one of the sponsors for the event today, the main sponsor, I guess, for the event today. And I got a story about Penn rods I want to tell you. So, when I first moved here 15 years ago, I got in a rockfish tournament. I wanted to meet people, so I joined the Seven River Riding Cake Club, Sam. And that's their motto is a drinking club with a fishing problem. And it probably is. Great guys in that club. They had a tournament, and they invited me in the tournament. It was one of those tournaments where you draw and you get a partner and you go out and fish. And so we went out and fished, and I was fishing with a dude named Evans from over in Severna Park. And actually over on the Severn River. And so we fished all day and didn't catch fish. It was terrible. One of the worst fishing days I've ever had. we were coming back. I put in at Mattapeak, and we were coming around the corner there to make the turn to come into Mattapeak, and I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I said, that looked like a fishing rod. So I turned around the boat and went back, and it was a fishing rod. It was floating. It was a Penn surf rod. And so I reached down there to grab it, and it took off. I thought, well, that's interesting. Must be a fish on there. So we ran it down. I grabbed it, picked it up, reeled it in. There was a 36-inch rockfish on it. We won the tournament.
That's awesome.
I think we eventually came clean about that story, but and we donated all the winnings back anyway, so it didn't matter. But kind of an interesting story about a Penn rod. But what's important to you, Sam, when you talk about a fishing rod?
Well, the first thing has got to be the height of the rod. That's definitely one thing I want to consider. So a lot of times when we're jigging, we got to deal with T-tops, we got to deal with smaller boats, stuff like that. Having a rod, anything over, I would say 7 foot, it starts to become a little bit of a problem. Especially with some of the actions we're putting onto these jigs. The more and more we do it, a lot of times we're really starting to really get aggressive with some of the actions we use. With a longer rod, you can start to kind of be a burden on yourself, break the tip, stuff like that.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. The advantage of a long rod is you can cast a lot easier with it. So if I'm using topwater plugs or slinging crankbaits or something, I might want to use a little bit longer rod than I'm going to be using for jigging for rockfish. But when you're jigging for rockfish, shorter is better. 6 foot is not too short. Let me see that rod. This is one of Ron's JLS rods. I'm 6'4". That's about right for this rod. It probably started out a little longer than that, and I have put a new tip on it along the way. But that's right. So the reason that you want a shorter rod is because it takes less time with a shorter rod to transmit that strike. You can feel more sensitivity with a shorter rod. It takes less time to transmit the signals that come up through the line to your rod tip, down the rod, through the reel, into your brain. And so the shorter the rod is, usually the faster it is too, which is another aspect of a rod. What kind of rod, what kind of speed do you like on your rod?
Most folks are going to be looking for like a fast or even an extra fast. Having that quicker tip helps out with a lot of different things. One thing I've noticed with the faster tip is that rod getting back to straight again. And when you have that, you're able to be ready to jig again. If you have a rod that's like a noodle, it's bouncing all around, it's kind of hard to be ready to jig it again. But with that faster tip, it shoots back into the plane a lot better.
That is exactly right. And so think of it in terms of amplitudes and frequencies. I once did a talk, and in my second book, which is called The Right Stuff, there's a whole chapter about amplitudes and frequencies, which all of life really comes down to amplitudes and frequencies, but so does fishing especially. So think about a rod, how it wobbles. So a soft rod, also called a slow rod, wobbles more than a fast rod, or an extra fast rod even wobbles less. So think about that as a frequency. So that, look at a sine wave, they're going up and down. So you've got a slow rod, that sine wave is really big, going up and down and up and down. But with a fast rod, those sine waves are really tight. So it just doesn't wobble much. Once again, it transmits the strike a whole lot easier into your brain, into your frontal cortex, which is where you're making the decision, hey, set the hook, dummy. Something's on your line out there. So speed. So the first aspect of a rod is the length. The second aspect is speed. You want a fast or extra fast rod. And what's the third aspect? The third aspect is weight. How heavy is that rod? So rods usually come in different weights, and you know about ultralight rods, which we're using for fishing for perch and sometimes shad. Light, medium, heavy, extra heavy. It goes on up. So we typically use either medium or medium heavy rods for rockfish. I like medium. I don't have a medium heavy rod for rockfish. I do use them for cobia or redfish, but I don't use them for rockfish. I like medium rods. If you look at this, you probably think, well, that's a little bitty rod you got there. It's not very big around, about the size of a number 2 lead pencil down at the reel if you look at it. So how you gonna land big rockfish on a rod like that? Well, on that rod right there, I won the Kent Narrows tournament last year with a 38-inch rockfish, and I had no trouble getting it in. Probably took me less than 5 minutes to get it in. I've landed fish up to 53 inches on medium rods. And some of it has to do with how you fight the fish. Yeah, that's right. But we're not fishing like Kayla's fishing up there in the river, or around a whole lot of sticks and stumps and things sticking up in the way and things that are going to break you off. We're fishing in the wide open bay. So there's nothing going to get between you and that fish usually, unless you're fishing structure or you're fishing around the bridge pilings or something. So you can get away with a lot lighter equipment. Why do you want lighter equipment? A lot of people will come down and say, hey, Kimbro, you're just going to stress those fish out using lighter equipment. Well, we're not. We're getting those fish in really quickly, even with lighter equipment. The reason you want to go lighter is all the way back to that amplitudes and frequencies thing. The lighter your rod is, the faster the frequency, the faster it transmits that strike into your frontal cortex.
Another thing I want to touch on real quick when we're talking about power and action, that extra fast or fast tip does another thing for you. We're fishing big hooks. These are 5, 6, 7, 0 hooks. Having that backbone that you have to drive those hooks is important. If you were fishing something like a moderate fast or even a moderate rod, a lot of times, because these rods are on the lighter side of things, you don't have enough power to drive those hooks. But having that faster tip means you got more backbone. So the rod is a little bit sadder than a lot of people think if they've never picked up a medium action rod we use for jigging.
Absolutely. And here at Anglers Today, they have a great assortment of rods. Different manufacturers. Penn is sponsoring the event. JLS Custom Rods, which is one I'm using and what I have been fishing with a lot lately. They have those in stock here. And everything's on sale today, so if you still got time, get on down here if you haven't come down and pick up a good rod. Second question, second most popular question that's always asked is, should I use a spinning reel or a bait caster? Well, the answer to that is it depends, and I use both. So you know the difference, right? This is a bait caster. And I always say this because, a lot of people I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of really good fishermen out here in the audience today. And I'm sure that there are a lot of them listening in online. And so I know you all know that, but sometimes people listen who don't really. And so a bait caster sits on top of the rod, and it's designed to really more for freshwater fishing, more for bass fishing, although you see them used more and more for saltwater. And over here, if you could pan over there, Lindsay, and look at some of Brian's Southern Girl sports fishing rods there, he has some spinning outfits that are just fantastic outfits that also work great for sniper fishing or for whatever. So there's a learning curve involved in learning how to use a bait caster, but I highly recommend, Joey, get your bait caster. I highly recommend that you learn how to use a bait caster. And the reason for that is because it makes it so much easier to reset your lure into the strike zone. So when you're out fishing, you're in a dynamic environment. Everything's changing. Maybe your boat's drifting, the wind is blowing, the tide is running, everything's happening, everything's changing, and you're trying to drop that lure into a spot probably the size of a pickup truck bed and keep it there. Well, what's going to happen once you get that lure out there and start jigging it, it's going to ride up in the current until it's not anywhere close to where the fish are. Well, with a bait caster, all I have to do is push that button and drop it right back down into the strike zone. I don't have to flip the bail over. I don't have to do anything. I can do it all in one hand while I'm holding the microphone. All I have to do is just drop it right back down to where the fish are. Every little detail like that will save you time in the long run, and it will end up with you catching more fish. And that's the idea, right? You catch like last year, I keep talking about this tournament last year, but it's a perfect example of how we were fishing up at Hodges Bar, and there were so many fish. I mean, it was crazy. The fishing was so good. A fish every cast almost. But our objective when you're tournament fishing, obviously, is to get the bigger fish out of the schools. So we get a little fish in, you want to get that fish in and get it off as quickly as possible so you can get the bigger fish. And I'll talk about some techniques for locating those bigger fish here in just a few minutes. But everything you can do to save yourself time will help. Now, when I'm in a windy situation or I'm throwing topwater plugs, something that has a lot of wind resistance, I'm more than likely going to be using a spinning outfit in that situation. Or if I'm fishing with people who don't have a whole lot of experience fishing, I recommend that you start out with a spinning outfit. You can graduate to a bait caster at some point, but start out with a spinning outfit. That's what you want to do. If you go out with a guy and you haven't fished too much before, I think Brian is coming up after me with Southern Girl sports fishing, and he's going to talk about some of the things he does with kids. He's not going to be giving those kids bait casters. He's going to be giving them spinning outfits because he wants to teach them how to fish, teach them how to tune in on the rod. That's the most important thing, is tuning in. And the rest is just mechanics. So you know, it kind of depends on your situation, but if you'll take the time to learn a bait caster, it will pay off for you in the long run.
Another advantage to me with a bait caster is I can get a lighter outfit with the same power and same strength that I'm getting with that medium action and stuff like that. When you're fishing with a spinning rod, typically you have bigger guides, you have a heavier reel. 3000 series reel is going to be heavier than a lot of our 150, 200 size bait casters we're using. You can get a lighter outfit, and when you're out there jigging all day and hopefully catching big fish, you're going to get worn out, especially when we're jigging aggressively in some of the summer months, stuff like that. Yeah. Having that lighter outfit can definitely help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Number three question. The third question that's most frequently asked is, what kind of line do I put on my reel? Seems like an easy question. You ask 5 anglers what kind of line to use, you're going to get 5 different answers. It's a lot of personal preference. There's a lot of personal preference that comes into line. If you go into the angler store right now and look at the line counter, you're going to see at least 10 different brands of line in there, and probably more than that. And the reason for that is we all have it in our head that this kind of line is better than another kind of line. If you will check my YouTube channel, you'll see it's just Shawn Kimbro at YouTube. You'll see that I have several videos on how to select line, and there's different kinds of line. There's flat wound line, there's round. If I'm jigging, I'm using braided line. Why braid? Amplitudes and frequencies, same thing. Braided line has virtually zero stretch, and with zero stretch you get tighter sine waves, you get tighter frequencies, you get more sensitivity. And the smaller the line is, also you get less stretch and you get more sensitivity. Now, if I'm fishing up at the river or around the bridge piling or something, I'm going to use pretty heavy braid. But if I'm fishing in the open bay, I can get away with 10-pound test all day long and not have any problem. I rarely use anything over 10-pound test in the open bay. There's just no reason to. So if you look at line, it will tell you on the package the diameter of the line. And there's really not a whole lot of difference in the diameter between 10-pound test and 20-pound test line. If you look at it, it will say, you know, the same diameter as 5-pound test monofilament or something like that. So you say, well, yeah, I could get away with 20-pound test. It will cost you in the long run. It will cost you in sensitivity. But even though there's not that much difference in the size of that line, remember, you've got probably 50 feet of line out there. The current is blowing. It's moving that line around. You've got a big bend in your line. The smaller the line, the faster the frequency, the quicker you feel the strike, the quicker you can jerk that slack out of the line, the quicker you set the hook into the fish's mouth. So 10, 15-pound test is what I recommend to start with if you're fishing in the open bay, if you're fishing farther north, if you're fishing in the river, or you're fishing back in the holler somewhere where there's a lot of trees and stuff. Then in that case, I would go with a little bit heavier line.
I would agree. Everything on that. The only thing I would say is if you've never ever fished with braid before, instead of going to 10, try 15 first, because you will be a little bit more susceptible to wind knots. Once you get the hang of that braid, though, by all means, please scale down.
Yeah, and that question probably should have made my list, is what I do about wind knots. So a lot of times when you're jigging, you get your rod tip. It's too much slack in your line. Always as a result of too much slack in your line. When you get that much slack in your line, it's got to go somewhere when you drop your rod tip, and it'll wrap around. And I I don't know how it does it, but it creates a knot that you just can't hardly get out. And it's really hard. And I've been fishing for, I hate to tell you, but I've been fishing for at least 60 years, and I still can't get those damn knots out. It's just almost impossible. But yeah, that happens sometimes. Which brings us, I got my cheat sheet here, and let me look at my next question here. And it is, what kind of soft plastic baits should I use? So, I mentioned earlier that I don't just use soft plastics. I use topwater plugs. I use, all kinds of different lures. But for jigging for rockfish, we typically use soft plastic lures. Well, I'm here sharing a booth with Billy from Bustin' Baits, and he just happens to have some really nice baits out here. I think that's a Rich Jenkins jig head on there. Rich is one of my fishing partners. It's got a real nice look at all the color contrast in that. I'm a big fan of color contrast. So, what kind of baits do I use? If you go down a little way down the aisle here, you will see a stand out there for Z-Man Custom Baits, and I believe they're 10% off, and so are Billy's Baits here. And I know BKD is one of the sponsors here too. Every soft plastic bait has its own advantages and sometimes disadvantages depending on the situation. So, what bait should you use? You should tune in with whatever bait is appropriate for the situation that you find yourself in. For example, Z-Man baits float. Bustin' baits sink. Bass Candy Delights, BKDs, float. Can't think of the bait kind right now, but a lot of them sink. So if I'm fishing the bottom and the fish are holding really tight to the bottom, I probably want a bait that sinks so I can get it down quicker. But if those fish are suspended, I'd rather have a bait that floats. One of the advantages of a floating bait, and this is one of the reasons I like Z-Man so much, is because you can balance the size of the jig head with the lure, and it will alter the angle that lure floats in the water, that lure falls in the water. So a heavy lure on a heavy jig head falls straight down, just like that. But if you put a floating lure on say a 5/8 or a 1/4 ounce jig head, it's going to fall at an angle, more of a 45-degree angle. That's important when you're fishing for suspended fish. You want those angles. That's why they call it angling. That's what we're talking about, is different kind of angles. You want that angle so you can make those lures work for you. What's your favorite baits?
7-inch Z-Man streaks.
7-inch Z-Man streaks, and you can't go wrong. And that's the lure.
Yeah.
I keep talking about the Kent Narrows tournament because it's coming up in June, and I'll mention it again. The Kent Narrows Light Tackle Tournament is probably the most prestigious light tackle tournament in Chesapeake, and I encourage you to get into it. If you haven't signed up yet, you can sign up online and get into it. I've won that tournament 7 out of the last 10 years, either me or one of my fishing partners on my boat. And the way we've done that is a lot of what you just said right there with that particular bait, and it goes back to that angle. Of what we're looking at for how those lures float. So Kevin was nice enough to bring a Z-Man lure, and he brought the diesel minnow down. And so one of the advantages of this, I can show you a little better on the back there, and thanks to Lindsay for doing all that. She's been holding her arms up all day long.
I'm used to it.
And so, great job. You might notice that these have a paddle tail on them. So there's straight tails and paddle tails. And so I've been fishing for a long time, and most of my fishing partners have been fishing for a long time. We like straight tails just because we can put a lot of action in those lures with our jigging. But there are a lot of people who prefer paddle tails because it comes with action, especially if you're fishing in current. Like if I'm fishing up in the river, I'm probably going to want to use a paddle tail. Or if I'm fishing somewhere where there's a lot of current, I probably want a paddle tail. Otherwise, I'm going to probably use a straight tail. Like the straight tail better. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. One thing I want to do though is touch on size. So 10 years ago, we had a little bit more bait in the water. We had some more fish in the water. And one thing I would notice is when you find a school of fish, you're catching fish in a relatively the same size range. Well, the assumption I've made over the past couple of years with less bait, less fish is a lot of times we're catching a 16-inch fish in one cast and a 30-inch fish in the next cast. Have you ran into any of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm fishing a lot bigger baits more often. I'm fishing in those same schools of bait, those same schools of fish. I'm putting on that bigger bait and getting bigger bites, trying to avoid the smaller fish. But if you find a bunch of fish in this, you're perfectly happy catching 20-inch fish all day, a 5-7-inch bait might be better for you.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. As I've agreed with everything that Sam says. And one of the reasons you always want to move that fish up is because bigger fish just like bigger baits. Big fish get big by being smart. And one of the things about being a smart fish is that you don't eat that often. But when you do eat, you want a big bite. And so that's why we use the bigger baits when we can. Now, it's also important to match the hatch. So if there's just a little bait out there, if there's just little glass minnows or bay anchovies or something, I'm probably not going to be using a 7 or 10-inch lure. I'm probably going to be using a 4 or 5-inch lure. But there are opportunities, especially when you're on menhaden, when you're on bigger fish, where you're going to want to use those bigger lures. Yeah. So if they're hitting 7-inch lures, move to 8-inch. If they're hitting 8-inch lures, move to 10-inch. Always try to move them up, because that's how you get to the bigger fish. That's how you get those bigger fish out of the schools. Always try to go bigger than what they're eating, because that will get those bigger fish typically out of the lure. Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. All right, moving on. The next question is very closely related, and that's just color. Now, you may have noticed that what we've been holding up, the 2 lures that I've held up so far have been chartreuse. So when you think about it, and I heard Kayla say earlier, and I agreed with everything Kayla said, she likes natural colors. Remember that Kayla is fishing up in the river more than anything, and she's using those bass techniques up there to get those rockfish out of the rivers. Around here, I like to use really bright colors, and the only reason for that is because I want to show the fish something they can see. So if you drove here today, or if those of you are listening from home, if you're out driving around and you drive through a construction zone, you probably notice that there's barrels there. And what color are the barrels? They're orange, right? And if there are workers present, they're wearing vests or t-shirts, and what color are they? They're yellow. They're yellow or chartreuse. Well, the reason for that is those are the 2 colors that we as humans see best. Well, it just so happens that rockfish see very similar to humans do. They see a little better in low light situations, as well they should, because they live in the water, but they still see pretty close the way we do. And those are the colors that they see best too. So my main objective is to get a lure that they can see. I think I can trick them into biting that lure, but first they have to see that lure. And so that's why I like to use those bright colors. Now, not always. There are times, especially in very clear water, I'm going to use a darker bait. I'm going to use a more natural looking bait. Typically for the bay, which is dingy, we very rarely have visibility over 5 feet in the bay. Then I'm going to use brighter colors so they can see. And I like color contrast. Color contrast stimulate reaction strikes. If you've ever watched the bass tournaments, and I like to watch them because I pick up stuff from the bass pros, you'll notice that they're always talking about reaction strikes and the value of getting reaction strikes. And so when fish are feeding, especially rockfish, it's not hard to catch them. You can throw a natty bow can with a treble hook on it out there, and you'll catch a rockfish if they're breaking into birds. But we're talking about structure fishing, or fishing around the pilings or somewhere, where it's a little bit more difficult. And so you got to trick those fish into reacting, into striking that lure, even though they might not be particularly hungry. And that's where color contrast comes in. If you ever watched a big school of say menhaden or some kind of saltwater bait fish, let's think about saltwater bait fish for a minute. And all of a sudden, a swordfish comes darting through, and those fish all move at one time in the school. They go like that, right? And when they do, you see a flash. Maybe it's a flash of sunlight. Maybe it's a gill flash of red when they bolt. But you see that contrast. That's what stimulates the reaction. That's what makes them bite. That's why we do stuff like this. This is one of Billy's skirts. Probably makes them, maybe Rich makes them, who he is making. Look at the colors. What the colors that I was just talking about. Those are the colors that I want on there. I want those stimulating colors. I want those color contrast. Same situation here. Color contrast can make all the difference for you. And this is not any new news. I collect old lures. I've got some lures dating back in the 1800s, and I especially like those in the 1920s and 1930s. They're all about color contrast. All those lures have color contrast to them, and we've known that. Fishermen have known that for years. Sometimes we forget, but it works.
The only other thing I would touch on color is we do fish a lot of the bright baits, but the one time I found that I really like a natural bait is, when you're out there on a big school of fish and you're looking at the fish around, you see all this bait, you see all these actively eating fish, and you throw a really natural bait. A lot of times, I think they just don't see it. I think it just blends in, and that's when those brighter, those vibrant colors with the color contrast helps. But if I'm fishing structure a lot of times, I want a more natural pattern a lot of times because there might not be a ton of bait around there. There might be one or two fish that I'm fishing on, and I want that more natural color.
Yeah. And that's one of the cardinal rules of fishing. Clearer water, more visibility. You want to make longer casts. You want to use more natural looking lures. Darker water, that's when you want to use the bright colors. Like I said, the Chesapeake, a lot of times it's darker water, and that's why. Let's move ahead to the next question. What kind of topwater plug should I use? And I should have gone in Anglers and picked up a topwater lure, and I don't have any out here, but I can tell you all about them because I love topwater fishing. And we're coming up on topwater season. The season's opening back up next weekend. When it does, you can bet that I'm going to be on a flat somewhere at the mouth of the river throwing a great big old topwater plug. Stillwater Smackets. I'm not talking about the little ones, the 7-inch. I don't want anything to do with the little Stillwater Smacket. A lot of people like them. I don't like them. I'm looking for big fish. I want to catch those biggest fish out of the school. If I miss a 20 or 25-inch fish because the lure's too big, I'm okay with that. I'd rather use the big lure to get the big fish. Same way with hidden lures. Topwater lures basically come in two categories. One is a spook and the other is a chugger or a popper. So a spook is designed to walk the dog with it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And when you do it right on a real calm day, it leaves a trail behind it. It looks like an eel or a snake or something on top of the water. Fish can hardly resist it. And I love spooks. Sometimes when fish are more aggressive or if it's windy, you want to cause more of a commotion on the water. Maybe I want to call them in. Maybe I'm up on the Susquehanna Flats and I just want to call a big fish in. I know they're around there somewhere. I just need them to notice my lure. That's when I'm going to use a big old chugger. Kapoosh, kapoosh. I want them to hear that. I used to do a lot of red drum fishing for bull reds down in the Pamlico Sound. And we would call them in there from miles away using that's the whole concept of a popping cord. It works the same way, but you can do the same thing with a topwater plug and maybe put even a bustum bait or something on behind it. So you get their attention with a topwater plug. Kapoosh. They may not be inclined to hit that topwater plug, but they'll hit that lure that you've got tied on behind it. Popper and a dropper. It worked since I was 6 years old. We've been doing that, and it works good. So topwater plugs, all the same principles about color still fall into place. I never use a sinking topwater plug, although they make some. I really haven't figured out that. But you need something to float on the water. Use spooks when it's calm, when you think you can trick those fish into hitting something on the surface that doesn't have a lot of action. When you've got really aggressive feeding fish or you need to call them in, use chuggers. Got anything to add on that, Sam?
Hooks. I like to switch out to inline hooks, not only because it's better for the fish, but I also feel like when you do hook that fish, they stay on a little bit better. It's a bigger hook, but it's causing a lot less damage than a treble hook. And treble hooks, for whatever reason, as many hooks as they got on there, I don't think they keep fish pinned very well.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And so I think, good. Good. I can always count on Kevin. So Kevin's brought a couple here. This is Sarah Spook. So Hedden has been around I got to visit the Head Museum up in Doziak, Michigan earlier actually it was last year. And that variation of that lure has been around since 1915, 1920. And look at the color contrast, red and white. You just can't beat it. Lonely Angler. So Lonely Angler is actually a company based out of Boston, but Ben, who's the rep for that, lives right here in Cape St. Clair. And he's a good fisherman. And this is another great lure. And look at the colors on that lure. We've been talking about that all day. It's another good lure. He's got a bigger version of this that's good, and also Lonely Angler makes a spook that's really good. There's one that's totally white or bone color. I think he calls it a ghost. It's fantastic. Another fantastic lure. Sam, you're exactly right about inline hooks. And there are times if I'm tournament fishing, I might leave a treble hook on the front and put an inline on the back. But that's in only a specific situation when I don't want to lose a fish. The rest of the time, I'm using those inline hooks. And I heard Mike doing a report earlier about hooks. So there's a lot. And anybody here at Anglers, come in and talk to Sam, Lindsay, anybody, and they'll be able to point you in the direction of where those inline hooks are that you can swap out. The way to match the hook to your treble hook, an inline hook to your treble hook, is the gap of the hook. Just hold it up to the treble. You want the inline hook gap to match one of the tines on the treble. Just one, not all of them. It doesn't need to be as big as all of them, just to match one time. And that's the way you get that to work.
And when you hook them on those inline hooks, man, they stay pinned because it's like the perfect hook, you know.
You get more penetration.
Yeah.
Because those trebles get hooked all outside of the mouth and in the face and on the side of the fish and everywhere else, and in your hand. And that's what, you know, when you catch a topwater fish and you're bringing him in, I don't even carry a net on my boat most of the time, and so I'm reaching down with my hand and bringing that fish in over the edge. And if it's a trailer hook, you know, one of those hooks is probably the fish, and there's 5 more that could probably go in my hand, and usually they do. I had one go all the way through my knuckle one time. Fortunately, it was cold enough that I could pull it out, and I didn't feel it until I got home and started warming up the next day. And I've had the pleasure of pulling quite a few out of other fishermen's hands over the years, and I got a pretty good technique for that. So if you get a hook in your hand, just call me. I'll come over. Kidding. All right, moving on. Jig head, size of the jig head. What size jig head should I use? You match your jig head. If you notice, this jig head is going to come in different sizes. That looks like a 1/2 ounce jig head right there. And that's a pretty common size. 3/4 ounce, 1 ounce, 1.5 ounce, 2 ounce. I noticed that Lonnie down here's got some of his jig heads out there. They're great jig heads, and he's got some even 3-4 ounces out there. And so what you want is a jig head that's heavy enough to get that lure to the bottom. But you don't want it poof, right down in the bottom really hard. You want it lightly touching the bottom, but it has to touch the bottom so that you can feel it. That's the main thing. You've got to be able to feel that lure when it comes in contact either with the bottom or with some kind of structure or with a fish. Now, once you really tune in, my dad used to have a saying called think down the line. And anytime we go fishing, he'd say, boy, you got to think down the line. And by that, he meant that when you're really tuned in, when you've got the right rod, the right line, when you've got all your equipment going for you, you can tell the difference when that lure hits mud or sand or a rock or a stump. You can tell the difference between oysters and clams. You can even tell the difference between clay and sand. But you have to be tuned in. Well, tuned in is just something that comes with practice. And the more you practice, the more you're tuned in you can get. It's just what, it's in your head. You got to use the right equipment. That's why I'm doing this talk, and why we've all been talking today is to talk about that equipment. But it's really all in your head. And you've got to get it in your head about how to think down that line and really tune in on that lure. So the size of your lure should allow you to touch the bottom, but not to pound the bottom, if that makes sense. Now, what if you're fishing in 50 feet and the fish are suspended up about 20 feet? Still the same thing. I still will cast out and try to feel the bottom, even in 50 feet. Because if I can feel the bottom in 50 feet, I know I can feel that fish strike at 20 feet, which is probably where they're going to be suspended. So that's the philosophy. Windy days, use heavier jig heads. There are days when I'll use a 1/4 ounce or a 1/2 ounce. But typically, if I had to pick one, if I had to only use one, I'd use a 3/4 ounce most of the time. And they have all different selections here at Anglers Luncheon.
It's really hard to be successful with casting jigs if you don't have a selection of jigs with you at all times.
Yeah, you need a good selection. You need a little bit of everything. And it helps to fish with other people. Like if I'm fishing with a 3/4 ounce and my buddy's fishing with a 5/8 ounce and he's getting more strikes than me, I'm probably going to switch to 5/8 ounce, right? Just like anybody else would. And it's the same with colors. You know, we talk about, I've heard people say colors don't matter. And those same people are always asking me for a chartreuse or an orange lure when they see that they're getting outfished with their white lure. Not that white's not sometimes a good color, but it does. I also heard people say, as far as jig heads go, that my favorite color is lead. There used to be a fishing guide who would say that quite a bit around here. Well, he's changed his tune now because he's not catching as much fish as the people are who are going out and using colored jig heads and color contrasting jig heads because they catch more fish. That's part of it. Let's move along, and I'm wrapping up now, down to the top three. Number three, the third question I get asked more than anything else: why am I missing strikes? I'm going out, I'm feeling the fish, or maybe I'm not feeling them. Everybody else is catching fish on the boat, but I'm not catching fish. What am I doing wrong? It's all in your head. It's all about tuning in. It's all about thinking down the line and feeling those strikes. And what typically happens when somebody goes out and they're jigging for the first time is they're popping that rod way up and then dropping it. And maybe they see me fishing, and I put a lot of action in my lures. And let me show you my stroke. And this is, some people call it power jigging, and some people call it snap jigging. I don't know what you call it, but here's what it looks like. So what I want you to notice there is, first of all, where's my index finger? My index finger is on the blank of the rod, right there. And the reason for that is that's where my main sensitivity point is. I don't want anything on the front of this rod. I don't want any cork up there. I don't want any plastic up there. I don't want anything. I don't even want those threads up there if I can get rid of them. I want to be able to touch that rod. I want to be able to palm the reel and touch the rod. That's also my fulcrum. That's my sensitivity point, and it's my fulcrum for jerking the rod, for bringing the rod up. But when I bring it up, you notice there's a stop. And the stop is to let the slack come out of your line. So, and you got to be careful, because if you move that rod any at all up there, when it gets up to the top, that's going to cause that rod tip to wrap, the line to wrap around the rod tip. And then you just slowly lower. So you want that lure to fall through the water naturally. You don't want it to fall unnaturally. You don't want it to go slower than it would normally fall, and you don't want it to go faster. That's where your weight comes in, the type of lure comes in. You're matching that. Your stroke is all about putting action in that lure. And snap jigging will get fish to bite that are not inclined to bite. That was how you get those reaction strikes when you don't think they'll bite. I don't always snap jig. Sometimes I just very barely move the rod. But when I can get a fish, when I'm trying to get bigger fish out of schools, man, it sounds like bow and arrows going off all over the boat, because there's all that. You can hear that going on. The same with my fishing boats. Yep. Okay. Let's move up. Number 2. What is the second most asked question? And that is simply, what electronics should I use? I could talk here for another 3 hours about what fish finder is the best, and I'm not going to. I'm going to give you the number one rule for a fish finder. Folks, buy a fish finder that you know how to use. How many times have you put the nicest Simrad XLR live scope, all the bells and whistles? Do you see people put that on the boat and they get out there and they're punching, they don't have a clue how to use it. That happens to everybody. And some people never learn how to use it. Never, ever. I've gone out with people who have fished for 20 years on the same fish finder and they still don't know how to use that fish finder. Use something you know how to use. There are a lot of fantastic electronics out there. If you can go to a class, you almost have to now, because there's so much to know about fishing electronics. And I'm not just talking about fish finders, but also GPSs. So learn as much as you can about the unit that you use. My philosophy on that is I stick with the same brand that I've used all along, just because the menus look similar to me, to the menu that when I started out fishing, I was fishing those little green box flashers. And I still think I could go out and use one of those just fine. And you probably could too. but it's all about understanding what you see, and they're all pretty good that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the newer ones, they come out. As soon as you buy one next week, it's basically obsolete in some extent. Yeah. That being said, it doesn't have to be the newest, absolute newest to catch fish on it.
Yeah. So, I fish, I love fishing for rock fishing. I do a whole lot of rock fishing. This time of year, I'm doing a whole lot of pan fishing. And I've got a little 16-foot Eldo Craft boat. That's a boat made in Alabama. It was made in 1972, and I've had it ever since 1976. And I love that boat. But I've got a fish finder. It's a 4-inch. I can't remember what it is. Anyway, it's an old Lowrance fish finder. It does everything I need for that boat. I don't need live scope. I don't need all that for that little boat. Now, if I'm out tournament fishing and competitively fishing on Fishing Guide or something on the best electronics I can get, but I better know how to use them. So that's the short answer to that is get something you know how to use. It's really important. All right, coming down to the end, and my voice is just about gone, but I think I can make it to the final question. And the number one question that I get asked more than you will ever imagine, including today, on multiple occasions. Kimbro, where's the fish at? Am I lying, Sam?
No, that's a common question for a lot of people.
and of course it is, because we all think if we know where the fish are, we can go out and catch them. And the truth is, if you fish where the fish are, you're more than likely to catch a fish. And that's one of the number one rules of fishing, is fish where the fish are. And that's one of the things that people do wrong more than anything else. If I can buy everything we've talked about today, all the right equipment, put my boat in at Sandy Point, and go out and start jigging pilings, I might catch a fish. But I promise you, some of those pilings are going to be better than the others. And some of them are consistently better than others, and over time you learn where those better pilings are. It's the same with fishing spots. There are fishing spots that are better than others. A lot of it just comes with experience. A lot of it comes with mentorship, where somebody takes you under their wing and shows you some fishing spots or teaches you how to fish, and that's important. It's a very important part of fishing. The most important call that you will ever make when you're out there on the water is to call somebody in on fish when you're on a good bite. Because I guarantee you're going to make a friend. And another thing I guarantee you is next time they get on a bite, they're going to call you. And that goes for me too. And I always love to be selfish in these talks and say, hey, you get on a good bite, call me. And I'll return the favor. And that's the way it works. Now, if I call you in on a good bite, and the first thing you do is get on Facebook or get on the internet and start saying, hey man, you need to come out here at piling number 13 at the Bay Bridge, because it's red hot, and I tore them up today. You think I'm ever going to tell you again? No. No, social media there's a lot of advantages in social media for fishing, but there's also a lot of disadvantages. And one of the things that we do wrong is tearing up fishing spots. So other people who've been fishing those spots, all their lives, don't get to fish those spots anymore because they're run over. And that's happened a lot of different kinds of fishing, not just the striper fishing, but it does happen. I'm not saying don't tell people spots. We all do that, and that's a big part of it. But get your network. Build you a network. That's so important. How do you build a network? Just like we're doing right here today. Come out to the talks. Come to the fishing clubs. Come out to the meetings. Get to know people. I promise you, I'm a lot more likely, and I bet you are too, Sam, to tell people what's going on when you're at a club meeting or something like that than if they ask you over the internet. Because you're face to face, there's a value in just being face to face with people and talking to people, especially about fishing. So that's an important thing. But there are some principles that hold true about fishing spots that will apply no matter where you go, whether it's in a mountain stream or a farm pond or the Chesapeake Bay. And that is that usually the best fishing spots are spots where the current is interrupted at a 90-degree angle. Now that current might be interrupted by a structure or some kind of cover or a log or a rock or the Bay Bridge. But if you can find a spot where the current is interrupted as closely to a 90-degree angle as possible, that's probably going to be a good fishing spot. Even if it's an underwater ledge, that's going to be a good fishing spot. If you can't find a 90-degree angle, find a 45-degree angle. That's also going to be good. A good example within 5 miles of us right here is the sewer pipe that comes off the Kent Island side of Kent Island. We call it a sewer pipe because it is a sewer pipe. It's the clean water outflow from the Kent Island sewage treatment plant. It's probably a 14-inch diameter pipe, but it's got rocks on both sides of it. Comes directly out east-west. The current normally flows north-south. That's a 90-degree angle. It's a fantastic fishing spot. So I just gave you a spot. And there'll be fish there this spring, I promise you, not before too long. And you'll like it when you get there. And that's a good example. Now, when I'm topwater fishing on points, what points am I looking for? I'm looking for that point that dissects the current at a 90-degree angle. Love Point, perfect example. Chester River comes out, Love Point comes out, dissects a 90-degree angle. That's a good fishing spot. Look for those spots, even if it's underwater, even if it's ledges, even if it's a hump underwater. All those spots are going to turn out to be good fishing spots. That's how you build your arsenal of fishing spots, is to find locations like that. You got anything to add to that, Sam?
Not so much to that. That's some great points there. The one thing I think we may have skipped over a little bit earlier was leader.
Oh, leader. Yeah.
So this might be the one thing we might disagree on. So do you like fluorocarbon or mono?
I like fluorocarbon, and the reason, and I'll tell you why. And I look forward. Do you disagree? Do you use mono?
I use mono a lot. There are times definitely fluorocarbon is needed, but I do like mono for one other reason.
Okay. Hold it.
Yeah.
And let me tell you why I like fluorocarbon. So I'm kind of the philosophy that you do every little thing you can to improve your fishing. And so, I've been fortunate enough to fish with some really great anglers over the years. And a lot of times they started out not being such good anglers. A good example of that is Coach Jenkins, Brian's father-in-law. And so when I first started fishing with Coach, he hadn't jigged hardly at all. And so he live lined a lot, and he knew how to scrape crabs off the pilings and fish with crabs and stuff. But once he started jigging, man, we call that, me and my partner Jamie, we call that the heydays, because we go out and catch 20 fish and he'd catch one. And we really enjoyed that. That didn't last too long. Now if I go out with Coach Jenkins, he tears me up and just rips me a new one every time we go. He's just an amazing fisherman. He just figured it out. And in the same way, I've got Captain Jamie Clow, one of the best guides on the Chesapeake Bay. Another good example. He was fishing before I met him. Tom Lagana, another fantastic fisherman, great musician here. Kind of came up, figured out how to do it, and now outfishes me most of the time we go out. One time I was out with Coach Sam, and we're casting on some suspended fish. He's out fishing me 4-1. I'm like, dang, what's he doing? So I'm starting to pay attention, right? And I'm watching him. And then I start casting the same time he does. And it's like, so I cast the same time he does, the same spot he does. And I start jerking it the same way he does. Boom, he catches the fish, I don't catch a fish. That went on for about 30 minutes and I couldn't stand anymore. I'm like, all right, coach, what are you doing? What are you doing different that I'm not doing? He said, I'm using fluorocarbon. And I changed to fluorocarbon and I've never looked back. But tell me why I'm wrong.
So I'd say I'm like 50-50. If the water is less than 3 feet, I'm fishing mono, and it's not just because it's less visible. Well, fluorocarbon is going to be less visible, but mono has stretch, which when we talk about spooling a reel with mono, we say that's a problem, that stretch, because we're losing sensitivity. And I am going to lose a little bit of sensitivity with this 4-foot section of mono, but it acts as a shock absorber. And when I'm catching really big fish, hopefully I'm catching really big fish, I like that shock absorber. I think it's helped me land more.
And I completely agree with that. So if you read my books, especially Chesapeake Light Tackle, which is my first book, 10 years ago this year, it came out. Everything is just as pertinent today as the day it came out. And I hope if you don't have a copy, and I know a lot of you already do, but I hope you'll pick one up here at Anglers. Anglers is my #1 retailer for the book. But I talk about spinning outfits with monofilament for topwater fishing. Just for that reason. Like I'm 61 years old, Sam. When I topwater plug, when I'm throwing a spook and a big striper blows up on that spook, I jump out of my boots every time. Set the hook, the lure goes all the way over the top of the boat, and I miss the fish. Monofilament slows everything down. Another thing to remember is that monofilament floats while fluorocarbon sinks. That doesn't matter so much in the heavy lures that we're using here, but if you're on a trout stream somewhere and you're trying to get a little bitty midge or some kind of a small emerger or something down, you're going to want to be using fluorocarbon because it sinks. Just the opposite of monofilament. Now, monofilament will get waterlogged over time and it will sink too, but as it just comes off the spool, it's a little better. But that's a really good question.
What I found, when you get 3 feet or better visibility, I definitely see more fish bite the fluorocarbon for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I've really enjoyed being out today. It's been a beautiful day to be out here. I apologize that my voice is not what it should be, but I think we got through it all right. I want to thank Mike at Anglers, Lindsay for inviting me and for holding her hands up the whole time and filming this. Thank you very much.
Not
Lindsay.
a problem.
And by the way, Lindsay, you're overdue for a shop trip.
Yeah.
I've got some pretty good bourbon over there now that you need to try. But Sam, thanks.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate having you here. Everybody comes out to see you. You've been doing this for a really, really long time at a very high level. So we're very happy to have you out here. We've got a bunch of other stuff going on, big sales in the store. So we thank everybody for stopping by, and we hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you.